Autumn, year 1944. The Pacific War had turned in America's favor. Yet on one tiny coral island, 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, US, Marines and soldiers were about to fight a battle so bloody, so questionable in purpose, that it would later be called unnecessary hell. This is the story of Peleliu, a place where generals promised victory in days, but where men bled and died for 2 months in blistering heat, on ridges so jagged they were nicknamed the meat grinder. By mid of year 1944, Japan was on the defensive. US forces had swept through the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas. Guam was liberated. Saipan and Tinian had fallen. The island-hopping campaign was grinding forward step by bloody step toward Japan itself. But where to strike next? That question split America's top commanders. Admiral Chester Nimitz wanted a direct thrust through Okinawa and Formosa, even into China, bypassing the Philippines entirely. He argued these bases would serve as launch pads for the final invasion of Japan. General Douglas MacArthur disagreed. For 2 years, he had fought up through New Guinea and the Solomons, always promising to return to the Philippines. To him, the liberation of the islands was not just strategic, it was personal. In July year 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt traveled to Hawaii to settle the argument. He listened as both men laid out their plans. In the end, Roosevelt sided with MacArthur. The Philippines would be invaded. But that decision made one small island suddenly important: Peleliu. Before we go deeper into this story, a quick show of support. If you believe our veterans deserve more respect, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop respect in the comments. Now, let's get into the story. Located 600 miles east of the Philippines, Peleliu's airfield could threaten MacArthur's flank. To neutralize that threat, the island had to be taken. The invasion was codenamed Stalemate 2. On paper, the plan looked simple. The veteran 1st Marine Division, 28,000 strong, would seize Peleliu. The US Army's 81st Infantry Division, green troops on their first battle, would take nearby Angkor and stand ready as reserve. Major General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marines, was confident. He insisted Peleliu would fall in 3 to 5 days. But one legendary officer was less sure. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commander of the 1st Marine Regiment, pointed out a flaw. Of the 28,000 men, only about 9,000 were riflemen. The rest were artillery, engineers, and support. The supposed 3-to-1 advantage over the Japanese was misleading. Puller's warnings were brushed aside. Rupertus remained optimistic. The Marines would win quickly, he insisted. They were wrong. On the other side of the battlefield, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa prepared his 10,000 defenders. Nakagawa was no fool. He knew traditional banzai charges had been suicidal. Japan's new strategy, ordered by Premier Hideki Tojo himself, was attrition fukaku tactics. The Japanese would not throw their lives away in human wave assaults. Instead, they would fight from hidden fortifications, making the Americans pay for every inch. Peleliu's terrain gave Nakagawa the perfect battlefield. At the island's center rose the jagged Umurbrogol mountains, sharp coral ridges, caves, and ravines. Nakagawa turned this natural fortress into a labyrinth of bunkers, tunnels, and hidden gun positions. Some caves could shelter 1,000 men. Others were sealed with sliding steel doors, their guns poking out through tiny slits invisible from the air. The southern beaches, where the Marines would land, were lightly defended, a trap to draw them in. The real defense was the Umurbrogol, later nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge. To American observers, Peleliu looked like just another tropical island. But beneath the palm trees and jungle, a nightmare was waiting. At dawn on the 15th of September, year 1944, the US Navy opened fire. Battleships, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, Idaho, joined by cruisers and destroyers, unleashed hell. For 3 straight days, 16-inch and 14-inch shells pounded the island. Carrier aircraft dropped bombs in waves. To Marines waiting offshore in their landing craft, the bombardment seemed overwhelming. Great columns of smoke and flame rose skyward. The entire island was hidden behind a dark shroud of dust and fire. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf even declared he had run out of profitable targets. Not a single Japanese gun fired back. It looked like the defenders were destroyed. But inside the Umurbrogol caves, Nakagawa's soldiers waited, silent, patient, alive. On board the landing craft, Marines of the 1st Division sat in silence. Most were veterans, eating steak and eggs before the battle. Some painted their faces for jungle camouflage. War correspondent Tom Leah later recalled one Marine with grim determination, his big hands, in the last moments before the tough tendons drew up to kill. At 8:32 a.m., the first wave of amphibious tractors, LVTs, nicknamed alligators, churned toward Peleliu's beaches. Ahead of them, armored versions mounted 75mm guns, blasting at bunkers. The naval bombardment had cut many Japanese mines, and the smoke blinded enemy spotters. For a brief moment, luck seemed to favor the Marines. But as the LVTs neared shore, Japanese guns opened fire. Hidden 47mm cannons and 20mm machine guns raked the waves. Within minutes, the sea was boiling with explosions. 26 amphibious tractors were hit in the first 10 minutes. 60 more were destroyed or damaged in the first hour. The beaches turned into a slaughterhouse of burning vehicles and floating bodies. Marines leapt into the water, clutching rifles and ammo cans, stumbling toward the sand through geysers of shell fire. The Battle of Peleliu had begun. When the first waves hit Peleliu's beaches, they stepped straight into chaos. Shells crashed all around, fragments whirred through the air, slapping sand and slicing into men's bodies. War correspondent Tom Leah later wrote, "I saw a wounded man near me. His face was half bloody pulp. He fell behind me in a red puddle on the white sand." Private Eugene Sledge, a mortarman with the 5th of March Ines, recalled the sound of shrapnel buzzing and splashing into the water just yards behind them. To him, the beach was a nightmare in broad daylight. The Japanese had allowed the first waves to come ashore, then their hidden guns opened up from both flanks, raking the beaches with murderous crossfire. Dozens of LVTs burned in the surf. Marines staggered through smoke and fire, dragging rifles and ammo, scrambling for cover that barely existed. On the northern flank, Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's 1st Marines pushed inland. Within minutes, disaster struck. A Japanese 47mm shell hit Puller's amphibious tractor, nearly killing him and wiping out his entire communications section. The regiment was thrown into confusion, and then came the point. Just 100 yards from shore, the Marines ran into a 30-foot coral ridge honeycombed with bunkers and firing ports. It wasn't on the maps, it hadn't been touched by naval bombardment. From hidden slits, Japanese machine guns cut down Marines on the beach. Puller knew it had to be taken. He turned to Captain George Hunt's K Company. Their mission, assault the point head on. Hunt's men advanced inch by inch, crawling forward under relentless fire. They blasted pillboxes with satchel charges, grenades, and flamethrowers. Marines swarmed close to embrasures, throwing grenades inside before Japanese defenders could even reload. At last, Corporal William Anderson fired a rifle grenade into the main blockhouse. It ricocheted off the barrel of a 25mm gun and exploded inside, igniting ammunition stores. The entire bunker blew apart in a fireball, defenders running out in flames before being cut down. The point was captured, but at horrific cost. Hunt and K Company were now isolated. Night fell, and the Japanese counterattacked with fury. Mortars rained down. Infantry charged again and again in the darkness, screaming as they came. Marines fired until their rifles overheated, then fought hand-to-hand with bayonets and knives. For 30 hours, K Company clung to its position. By the time they were relieved, only 78 men of the original 235 were left. Hunt himself counted just 18 Marine Street ill, holding the line at the point. The price had been staggering, but their sacrifice saved the beachhead. Without K Company, the Japanese guns at the point might have annihilated the entire landing. While the 1st Marines struggled on the left, the 5th Marines pushed inland toward Peleliu's main airfield, one of the invasion's key objectives. By afternoon, they reached it. But Colonel Nakagawa had prepared a counterstroke. 15 Japanese Type 95 hectares Go light tanks rolled forward, supported by infantry. It was no banzai charge. This was a coordinated, disciplined assault. Unfortunately for Nakagawa, the tanks advanced too quickly, leaving their infantry behind. American artillery and Marine Shermans opened fire. One by one, the thin-skinned Japanese tanks erupted in flames. Infantry clinging to their hulls were cut down. The counterattack collapsed, leaving burning wreckage scattered across the airfield. Still, the Marines knew the fight was far from over. Every ridge, every coral outcropping seemed alive with hidden guns. By the end of D-Day, the Marines had secured a toehold on Peleliu. But the cost was appalling. Hundreds were dead or wounded. The beaches were littered with burning tractors, smashed equipment, and bodies lying in the sand. Puller's 1st Marines were bleeding heavily. Within the first 3 days, his regiment lost 1,236 men. Yet Major General Rupertus, watching from the command ship, remained confident. He insisted the island would be secured in a few days. His men on the ground knew otherwise. The nightmare of Peleliu was only just beginning. By the 17th of September, the Marines had secured the airfield and much of southern Peleliu. But the island's heart, the Umurbrogol Mountains, still stood in their way. The name mountains was misleading. The ridges were only 300 to 500 feet high, but they were sharp coral crags, honeycombed with caves, pillboxes, and tunnels. From above, reconnaissance photos had shown nothing more than green, rolling hills. In reality, it was a labyrinth of death. The Marines soon gave it another name, the meat grinder. Every ravine was a trap. Every slope was raked with machine gun fire. Japanese soldiers, hidden behind steel doors or deep in caves, waited until Marines were almost on top of them before opening fire. Flamethrowers and satchel charges could take one cave, but dozens more remained. For days, the Marines clawed their way forward, only yards at a time. If the enemy didn't kill you, the island itself tried to. Temperatures soared to 115 degrees. There was no fresh water on Peleliu, only canteens refilled under fire. Men collapsed with heat prostration, lying in the sun until comrades dragged them back. Helmets burned to the touch. The coral ridges reflected heat like ovens. Rain came only in sudden bursts, turning the battlefield into a muggy, steaming hell. Sleep was scarce, men collapsed for minutes at a time, only to be jolted awake by incoming fire. Private Eugene Sledge recalled that in Peleliu's heat and horror, he felt his humanity slip away. I resigned from the human race. I fired at anything in front of me, friend or foe. I had no friends. I just wanted to kill. Despite the carnage, Major General William Rupertus clung to his belief that Peleliu would fall quickly. Even as his Marines bled white, he told his commanders to maintain momentum. By day 3, the 1st Marines had already lost over 1,200 men. Entire rifle companies were reduced to a handful of survivors. Engineers, artillerymen, and even headquarters clerks were handed rifles and sent into the lines. The situation was desperate, but Rupertus refused to call in help from the U.S. Army's 81st Division waiting on nearby Angor. He insisted the Marines could finish the job alone. It was a decision that would prolong the suffering. As casualties mounted, reinforcements were needed everywhere. That included men who, at the time, were rarely seen in Marine combat units. African-American Marines of the 16th Field Depot men from the segregated 11th Marine Depot Company and the 7th Marine Ammunition Company stepped forward. Originally assigned to carry supplies and ammunition, they volunteered to haul wounded from the front under fire. Some took rifles and joined the fight directly. Though prejudice was still rampant in the military, on Peleliu, the color of your skin mattered less than whether you could carry ammo to the line or drag a wounded comrade to safety. Their courage under fire saved countless lives. On the 19th of September, Colonel Puller's 1st Marines were still being chewed apart in the Umurbrogol. That afternoon, Captain Everett Pope, commanding Company B, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, received orders. Take Hill 100. Company B had landed with 242 men. Now, only 90 effectives remained, but they climbed anyway, scrambling over coral under withering fire. By nightfall, Pope and his men reached the summit. Only then did they realize the maps were wrong. Hill 100 was not isolated. It was connected to higher ridges, all held by the Japanese. From above and both flanks, enemy fire poured down. Pope and his 90 men were surrounded. He could have withdrawn. Instead, Pope held his ground. He set up a perimeter no larger than a football field. That night, the Japanese counterattacked again and again. Marines fired rifles until their ammo ran low, mortars pounded their lines. When grenades ran short, the men hurled rocks, hoping the enemy would mistake them for explosives. Occasionally, they threw one of their few real grenades to keep the ruse alive. Lieutenant Francis Burke fought off a bayonet attack with his bare fists. Sergeant James McIlarnis smashed another attacker with a rifle butt. Fighting was hand-to-hand, desperate, primal. By dawn, only 9 Marines remained standing on hill, 100 Pope among them. He finally received the order to withdraw. The hill would not be retaken until the 3rd of October. For his valor, Captain Everett Pope was awarded the Medal of Honor. By late September, the 1st Marine Regiment was a regiment in name only. 9 rifle companies had been reduced to just 74 survivors. In less than 200 hours of combat, the 1st Regiment had taken 1,672 casualties, a staggering 71% casualty rate. Even Chesty Puller, the indomitable Marine legend, looked exhausted, worn down by impossible orders and relentless losses. At last, higher command intervened. Major General Roy Geiger, head of the 3 Amphibious Corps, visited the front. What he saw horrified him. He ordered the 81st Army Division into the fight over Rupertus's objections. The Marines would finally get help. On the 23rd of September, year 1944, fresh troops of the U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcats, landed on Peleliu's western beaches. Leading them was the 381st Regimental Combat Team. The Marines had been bled white. The 1st Regiment alone had suffered nearly 1,700 casualties in just over a week. Entire companies were reduced to handfuls of men. When the Army came ashore, the 1st Marine Regiment was finally pulled from the line, broken, shattered, but unbowed. Colonel Nakagawa's defenders had inflicted one of the highest casualty rates ever suffered by a U.S. unit in the Pacific, but the battle was not yet over. By late September, Japanese resistance was confined to the Umurbrogol Mountains. Their defensive pocket, about 400 yards wide and 900 yards long, was a maze of caves, tunnels, and coral ridges. The Army and remaining Marines surrounded the stronghold, but surrounded did not mean defeated. The Japanese fought on, refusing surrender, firing from concealed embrasures one moment and disappearing the next. To root them out, Americans turned to brutal methods: flamethrowers, napalm, satchel charges, and armored bulldozers that collapsed cave entrances, burying defenders alive. Every yard of coral costs blood. Days turned to weeks. The battle became less an advance than a systematic extermination. By October, Major General Roy Geiger ordered what was left of the 5th and 7th Marines withdrawn, leaving the Army to finish the job. From Peleliu's newly secured airfield Marine airbase, Peleliu Corsairs and Hellcats launched strikes just seconds after takeoff, so close to the front that bomb fragments sometimes showered the runways. The siege dragged into November. Japanese attempts to reinforce Peleliu by barge failed. Most were sunk by American planes and ships. The defenders dwindled, starved of food and ammunition, but never of will. Nakagawa's men fought on until they were trapped in a final pocket of caves. By late November, only a few hundred Japanese remained. Realizing the end was near, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa ordered his regimental flag burned. Then, following the code of Bushido, he committed ritual suicide. On the 27th of November, year 1944, the organized Japanese resistance on Peleliu officially ended. Out of 11,000 defenders, nearly every man was dead. Only 202 prisoners were taken, and of those, just 19 were Japanese soldiers. The rest were Korean and Okinawan laborers. For the Americans, the cost was staggering: 1,800 killed, 8,000 wounded, and the strategic value of Peleliu? Questionable at best. Within months, the island's airfield was barely used in the Philippine campaign. To many, Peleliu felt like blood spilled for nothing. And yet, Peleliu's story did not end in 1944. On the 27th of April, year 1947, nearly 2 years after World War II officially ended, a Japanese lieutenant named Tadamichi Yamaguchi led 26 surviving soldiers out of the jungle. Starved, ragged, but still armed, they finally surrendered. handing over Yamaguchi's samurai sword. It was one of the last formal surrenders of World War II. The Battle of Peleliu lasted more than 2 months. Out of 11,000 Japanese defenders, almost all were killed. Only 202 prisoners were taken alive. For the Americans, the price was staggering. 1,800 dead, 8,000 wounded, and an entire Marine regiment virtually destroyed. And in the end, Peleliu's airfield was rarely used. The island's strategic value proved minimal. Historians later called it unnecessary hell, a battle fought in searing heat on ridges of coral for little gain. But for the men who were there, it was no footnote. It was a nightmare carved into memory. Marines and soldiers fought not for strategy, but for the men beside them, for survival, for honor, for each other. Nearly 3 years later, in 1947, a final band of starving Japanese soldiers emerged from Peleliu's caves and surrendered, unaware the war had long since ended. Their ragged appearance was a haunting reminder of just how far the shadow of this battle stretched. Peleliu was supposed to be won in days. Instead, it became one of the most brutal campaigns of the Pacific War. A place where courage was tested, humanity was stripped bare, and the true cost of war was laid in blood across a tiny coral island. Unnecessary hell, but never forgotten.